Hello, hello. This is the first time I have done a YouTube live stream. I realize a lot of people are not aware of the existence of this channel, so I'm not expecting a huge turnout. I'm just going to simply post this to my Facebook page when I can. But good evening or good afternoon, soon to be evening. I believe the evening starts after 6 p.m. And I am, excuse me, Christopher Harris, Executive Director of Unhyphenatedamerica.org. And this is my ride along. So I guess I'll just get started on this. I saw an article and it was talking about, and this is actually the first time this article was published goes back to I think 2017, but it's recently been talked about again. And it was a projection that black wealth, meaning the wealth held by, as some people would say, African Americans, but if you know anything about me and Unhyphenated America, you understand I do not use that term to describe myself. When I do use it, it's just for argument's sake, just because that's what a lot of people are comfortable with using, but I would love to see the complete elimination of that term from our lexicon. So yeah, we're going to talk about black wealth, which basically means the wealth held by blacks in America and why it's projected to decrease to zero in about the next 50 years. But, you know, there's a lot of people in those articles, they'll sit there and they'll try to say that, they'll try to say that, well, it's due to things like AI, right? Artificial intelligence, and how the increase in the use of artificial intelligence and manufacturing and all these other low-paying jobs, low-skilled jobs will basically eliminate the need for the type of jobs that, unfortunately, a lot of blacks and other minorities, but in this case, specifically blacks, tend to have. And I was sitting there thinking about this. I'm like, you know, and I posted in the description of this video, there's a quote from former President John Adams, you know, one of those old dead white guys, right? We're not supposed to listen to them because they were, you know, old dead white guys. They're, you know, the founders and framers, and they owned slaves and so on and so forth, except John Adams never owned a slave. So you can't use that argument against him. In fact, he was a virulent abolitionist. So I think you have to actually listen to him because he has the credibility, and you can't destroy his credibility based off of calling him a racist or anything like that. So anyway, President John Adams, in a letter to President Thomas Jefferson, this is from 1814, so they're both out of office. Remember, John Adams was the second president of the United States. He was vice president to George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States. And the funny thing is, just to give you a little quick history, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were both founders and framers. They both took part in writing the Declaration of Independence, although it was more actively Thomas Jefferson who wrote it, right? But they were both part of the committee that helped to draft the Declaration of Independence. And then later on, when the nation was formed based off of our Constitution, they became bitter rivals. But then after the death of their wives, they became friends again, and they both wrote each other letters. There's just tons of letters that they wrote back and forth between John Adams up in Massachusetts and Thomas Jefferson down in Virginia. But they wrote a lot of letters to each other. And I guess the basis of this particular argument of this letter was just about wealth. And one of the things that John Adams said to Thomas Jefferson was that as long as property exists, it will accumulate in individuals and families. And then he went on to say that as long as marriage exists, families will accumulate knowledge and property. and wealth. And that's a paraphrase. The exact quote is there in the description. But, he said, hey, this is a truism of humanity. Now, I do have to jump and mention a quote from Professor Walter Williams, who's a distinguished professor of economics here in Northern Virginia at George Mason University. And one of the things he said was, prior to capitalism, the way wealth was accumulated was through basically plunder. I mean, in a nutshell, if you wanted to get rich, you got to go out there and rape and conquer and pillage. That was it. And then came, I guess you would almost say, mercantilism and free enterprise and capitalism was introduced. And now all of a sudden, an individual could create wealth without violating the unalienable rights of their fellow man. This is what Walter Williams talked about. Prior to capitalism, the only way wealth was accumulated was through pillaging and plundering other people. Capitalism made it possible to develop wealth by serving your fellow man. Do you understand that? The importance of how you can develop wealth simply by serving your fellow man. In other words, you learn to offer a product, good, or service into the marketplace that the marketplace wants or has the demand for, or you help to create a demand or a need for. And the more people that you provide a product, good, or service to, the wealthier you're able to become. And it's a shame because you have people out there who really want to believe that capitalism is this terrible system, but I always say, compared to what? I mean, because there's really only 3 economic systems. There's the one that basically all the wealth belongs to, kings and queens or whoever accumulates that power through, accumulates that wealth through pillaging and plundering. Right? It's not like your kingdom grows voluntarily, where other people say, hey, I think I'd like to join your kingdom. No. In order to grow your kingdom, in order to gain more ground, more assets, you have to go to those people who own that ground, those assets, and say, either give them voluntarily or I'll kill you. Which really isn't asking them to give voluntarily. It's either saying, give them up without a fight or give them up upon your death. That's what that's basically saying. That was that pillaging and plundering that was done. The other option is socialism, which means the state owns all this property, but the state grows through force, right? Because socialism itself is force. There's no voluntarism in socialism. People like to think that socialism is this great idea because people will voluntarily submit to socialism, but just like under kings and queens, people decide, that they don't want to fall under socialism. And what do socialists do? They conquer them. So there's really not much of a difference, although people like to think that socialism is democratic, right? They like to say it's democratic socialism, but it's not. It's still force. It's just because you call it democratic socialism, you think it's somewhat different. So really, what you have, the other option, the third option is capitalism and free enterprise, which means you have to make an initial investment. You have to take a risk. And then you have to provide a product, good, or service into the marketplace that you believe the marketplace wants. And maybe they do, maybe they don't. But if they do, and you're able to effectively and efficiently provide that product, good, or service into the marketplace, you can get rich. You can get wealthy. So, why are we talking about this? Well, one of the things that you'll see is that wealth builds over time. When you want something more for yourself and for your future generations, you'll make different decisions. And one of the things you want is something stable to build upon. Well, what's the most stable thing out there in society? It's the family. That's it in a nutshell, right? It is the family. It's the traditional nuclear family. It's a man and a woman coming together as husband and wife and choosing to raise a family. And you know what happens when you have that stable environment? Wealth can be passed on because you have an incentive, because every parent, not insane, wants more and better for their children, for their future generations. So what are they going to do? They're going to pass on. They're going to actively as well as passively pass on the knowledge that they've accumulated. It happens all the time. It's fathers teaching sons what they know. It's fathers teaching sons and daughters. It's mothers teaching sons and daughters what they know. It's passing on the accumulated knowledge, wisdom, skills from one generation to the next. Why? So that the next generation can build upon, so they don't have to start from zero again. See, one of the things that you have when families fail to form, or when they break up, it stops the passing on of knowledge and wisdom. So what ends up happening is subsequent generations have to start from zero. I want to tell you, there was a show, I used to love this show back when I was a lot more liberal. I can look back upon it now and a lot more sober-minded, and I still appreciate the show because it was well done, but I disagree with what they did. But it was a show called The West Wing, and Martin Sheen was the president. I don't know, some of you may have known about the show, but it was a very, very well done show. But it was, now I realize what liberal propaganda it was. But anyway, there was the show called The West Wing. I believe it was on NBC back in the 90s and early 2000s. And one of the episodes they were talking about, because the president was this Democrat. The president was a PhD with a PhD in economics, and he was comes from this this family that had been in the United States since the Revolutionary War. His family was from New Hampshire, and he had all those things going for him, and he's a PhD in economics, and had the Nobel Prize in economics, and then became a governor of New Hampshire, and then or Vermont, one of those two, and then he became president, right? But in this one episode, they were trying to get rid of, they were trying to implement the death tax, right? The inheritance tax, the death tax, whatever you want to call it. But that's what they were trying to implement. And they were just, the staff was walking around just full of, vim and vigor, just all excited. They're finally going to do this. They're going to stop all the wealth from being passed on. They're going to make sure the wealth is spread out evenly, right? As if wealth was finite. Let me say that first of all. See, all leftist ideas, the foolishness and wickedness of leftism, their economic views, are all based on the faulty premise that there's only one pie and it's only so big. And if you embrace that idea, then that means if you're a moral person, then that does mean that if one person gets a big slice of the pie, then that must mean that they're depriving another person of their fair piece. If that idea is true, if there is only one pie and it's only so big, and one person, you can go back to when you were a kid, right? Before you understood fractions, if your parents brought home a pizza or a pie, whatever you want to call it, some people call a pizza a pie, right? But if there was a pizza, a pie, a cake, whatever, you knew that you would look. Before you knew how to count fractions, when the pizza or the pie or the cake was being cut, you could eyeball and see that somehow, some way, your sibling got a bigger piece than you did. And you knew that was unfair. And you know what? It might be. Now, if your sibling's older than you and is bigger than you and has more responsibility than you, then maybe they should be getting a bigger piece of the pie. You hadn't thought about that. But once again, it's based off all leftist ideology from an economic standpoint is based off of the faulty premise that there's only one pie and it's only so big, and therefore one person who gets a large piece of pie has in fact deprived others of their fair share of the pie. Except, like I said, it's a completely faulty premise. The pie is not only so big because there's no real pie. There's no singular pie. With capitalism and free enterprise, the pie can grow and there can be multiple pies. I mean, you can simply point out the fact that I think in 1952, the GDP, so at the beginning of the Eisenhower administration, the GDP of the United States was, off the top of my head, about $500 billion. Now, if we adjust for inflation, that's probably, let's highball it and say that $500 billion in 1952 is really the equivalent, remember, what is inflation? It's the devaluation of currency, right, in terms of what your money could buy. So let's just say that based on inflation, the devaluation of currency, that $500 billion of the gross domestic product of the United States is really probably in 2019 dollars the equivalent, let's say, of $2 trillion. Now, I don't have that exact number, but let's just run with that. Well, if the economy was doing $2 trillion in 1952, and in 2019 or 2018, I guess is the last year on record, the economy of the United States did roughly $21 trillion. Here's a simple question for you. Is there, or was there 10 times as much wealth, 10 times as much output created and wealth generated than there was 65 years ago, 67 years ago, or 66, I guess you would say, right? Is there more than 10 times as much wealth today as there was before? Yes. The answer is yes. Did all that wealth only go to the exact same people who were wealthy before? The answer is flat out no. Do you have any idea how hard it is for wealth to go beyond 3 generations? There's so many reasons why. Look, outside of the intervention of government, which I'm totally against, wealth is very hard to pass on beyond 3 generations because those people who did the work to begin with know what the struggle was to create wealth. They usually end up making sure that their children learn what they learned and actually end up working side by side with them to create that wealth. The problem is, by the time the 3rd generation comes around, the grandchildren never saw the struggle. All the grandchildren have ever seen is wealth. And then a lot of people make the mistake of saying to themselves, I don't want my grandchildren to have any struggle, so I'm going to insulate and isolate them from any struggle. Never going to let them fall down, scrape their precious knee or anything like that. But also, you fail to teach them the work ethic. You fail to teach them the mindset which allowed you to create wealth. So what will typically happen is that 3rd generation, that grandchild, all they've had is wealth given to them, but they have no idea how to create it for themselves, and they certainly have no idea how to make that wealth grow. And what typically ends up happening is that wealth just goes away by the end of the 3rd generation, which is why we don't need the federal government getting involved and saying, oh no, let's take that wealth. You don't need that involved. And so going back to this episode of The West Wing, this idea of they wanted to finally push through the death tax. And they were all excited And they were like, okay, we got the votes in Congress. We're going to push this this death tax through, and the president's going to sign it. We're finally going to take all the rich people's money and give it to the poor, because that's how we're going to buy votes, right? Well, what they found out was they didn't have all the, somebody said to them, hey, before you go getting all happy, you might need to go back and count your votes. And they were like, what are you talking about? They was like, you don't have all the votes that you think you do. So anyway, the staff guys, the White House staff guys, start checking around, and lo and behold, they find out they do have some people who are not on board like they thought they were going to be on board for pushing through this death tax. And the way the episode finished out was, it turned out to be Congressional Black Caucus members who were not on board with this death tax. And they try to, the White House staff tries to strong arm these Congressional Black Caucus members, specifically the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus. And, and long story short, what the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus ends up telling them is, here's what you don't understand. This is the first generation. Now, this statement is not true, but they said this in the episode. They were saying this is the first generation that has finally had a chance to, first generation of blacks, has finally had a chance to accumulate some wealth. And if they don't have the ability to pass on that wealth to their children, how are black people ever going to be economically on par with white people? It was a fantastic episode, right? I mean, I really think that I would love to have everybody watch that episode. Excellent episode. But here's the thing. See, one of the things that's stopping black folks from passing wealth on, because really true wealth is generational. Oprah is rich. She's not wealthy. Wealth is generational. She has no heirs to pass her wealth on to. So essentially, when she dies, her money's going to go away, right? I mean, she's going to give it to charity and whatever like that. And, here's another thing. You got guys like Bill Gates, who has this giving pledge. And it's a ridiculous idea to me when you understand Econ 101, because, once again, there is no one singular pie. So this giving pledge that he has is based on the idea that all these people who've developed wealth are going to, all these billionaires, there's like $600 billion that they have in these accounts, or at least pledged to give through the giving pledge. And they're basically saying, we're going to give this money away because it's not a good thing for this wealth to be accumulated and simply passed on from one generation to the next. And I thoroughly disagree with them. I think maybe if all you're doing is giving your kids money, then yeah, that's a problem. But it's still your problem. If you created the wealth, you own it. It's your right to create it on. But real wealth actually is legacy. Real wealth passing on is a mindset. It's a thought process so that you can go out there and build upon that. But what's happening is that black families are not forming to begin with. And that's one of the problems with leftism, cultural Marxism. As I say, leftist, regressive, socialist ideology has incentivized black folks to not even form traditional nuclear families. So, of course, there will be no black wealth to speak of in terms of any large percentage of black folks who have wealth, because if there are not black families being formed, what is there to pass on? You're not going to pass wealth on when there's baby mamas and baby daddies. And the left knew what it was doing with this. See, if you really want to see black wealth, then you should be talking about the things I talk about, which is strong, traditional nuclear families. If you try to say that you want black folks to grow economically, but you're not talking about strong traditional nuclear families, I'm saying you don't know what you're talking about. You're either a liar or a moron. That's it. You know, the only way for black wealth to be created and passed on is when there is a strong traditional nuclear family. And the only people who are talking about creating and perpetuating strong traditional nuclear families are conservative blacks. You are not finding black Marxists, Congressional Black Caucus members. You're not finding any of them talking about the need for black families to be formed. You're not hearing that at all. You know, all you're hearing about is that they want the perpetuation of the welfare state, that we need to help make people more comfortable in their poverty instead of incentivizing people to create families. And one of the best ways you can help incentivize people to create families is to no longer pay people when they don't form nuclear families. So anyway, listen, I just wanted to kind of run all that past you. I hope I gave you something to think about. It's something that article is certainly not going to talk about, but really, if you wonder why there's going to be almost an elimination of black wealth, I have to run. Thank you for listening in. Once again, this is Christopher Harris, Executive Director of Unhyphenated America. Take care. God bless.